Top Cold War Stories, number 5. Inside a KGB operation that changed everything. Good evening, my friend. Wherever you are in the world tonight, I hope you're safe, comfortable, and ready to drift into a quieter state of mind. Before we begin, let me wish you something simple yet meaningful. May you have a peaceful night, and may your thoughts soften as the world outside grows still. Tonight we step into the shadows of history, into a time when silence carried weight, when secrets could shift the balance of power, and when entire nations moved like chess pieces across an invisible board. This is not a story of loud battles or roaring tanks. It is a story of whispers, of coded messages, of decisions made behind closed doors that quietly changed the direction of the world. During the Cold War, the conflict between East and West was not always fought on open battlefields. Instead, it unfolded in dimly lit offices, in anonymous apartments, and sometimes in the mind of a single individual. Tonight's story takes us inside one such moment, a KGB operation so subtle, so carefully constructed, that for years, much of the world never even knew it had happened. And yet, its consequences echoed far beyond the shadows in which it was born. So, as you settle in, let your breathing slow, your thoughts drift, and allow this story to carry you gently into the quiet depth of history. When you're ready, we'll begin. Now, let us begin. It is the early 1980s. The world is divided, not just by geography, but by ideology, by fear, and by a constant, quiet tension that hums beneath everyday life. On one side stands the United States and its allies. On the other, the Soviet Union. Between them lies a fragile balance, one built not on trust, but on deterrence, a balance that could at any moment collapse. Inside Moscow, behind layers of concrete, steel doors, and careful surveillance, sits an organization tasked with protecting the Soviet state at any cost, the KGB. To the outside world, it is an intelligence agency. But within its walls, it is something more complex. A system of control, of perception, of influence. And in this story, we step into one of its most ambitious operations. An operation born not from aggression, but from fear. At the height of the Cold War, Soviet leadership became increasingly convinced of a terrifying possibility: that the West might launch a surprise nuclear strike. This fear was not entirely irrational. Tensions had escalated. Military exercises grew larger. Political rhetoric sharpened. Each side watched the other, interpreting moves, guessing intentions, often assuming the worst. But within the Soviet system, uncertainty was dangerous. And so in 1981, a secret directive was issued. The KGB would begin a global intelligence effort, one designed to detect the earliest possible signs of a nuclear attack. This operation would come to be known as Operation Ryan. The name itself was an acronym in Russian, roughly translating to nuclear missile attack. But behind those simple words lay something much deeper. A vast network of surveillance, suspicion, and silent observation. KGB agents across the world were given new instructions. They were no longer just collecting general intelligence. They were now searching for very specific indicators, tiny, often mundane signals that might suggest an imminent strike. Things like unusual activity at government buildings, sudden blood donations, increased movement of military personnel, lights burning late into the night in key offices. Individually, these signs meant little, but together, they might form a pattern. And if that pattern appeared, it could mean the difference between preparation and annihilation. Imagine the pressure. A KGB officer stationed in a Western capital, perhaps London or Washington or Bonn. Every day they walk the streets, blend into the crowd, observe the ordinary. But now the ordinary has changed. A hospital receiving more supplies than usual is no longer just a hospital. It might be preparing for casualties. A government official working late is no longer just busy. They might be involved in something hidden. Even silence can feel suspicious. And so, slowly, almost imperceptibly, perception shifts. The world becomes a puzzle, and every small detail could be a warning. Reports begin to flow back to Moscow, thousands of them, each one carefully written, cautiously interpreted, often uncertain. But within the Soviet system, uncertainty has a way of becoming conviction, especially when filtered through layers of hierarchy, where no one wants to underestimate a threat. At the same time, in the West, life continues largely unaware. People go to work. They watch television. They discuss politics, perhaps. But few truly grasp how close the world may be to misunderstanding itself. Because that is the quiet danger of this story. Not missiles, not bombs, but interpretation. In 1983, tensions reach a new peak. The United States begins a series of large-scale military exercises known as Able Archer. To Western planners, it is routine, a simulation, a rehearsal. But to the Soviet Union, already on edge, it looks different. Through the lens of Operation Ryan, these exercises begin to resemble something far more serious. Troop movements increase, communications intensify. Command structures shift into simulated wartime modes. From the outside, it begins to look real. And inside Moscow, analysts start to connect the dots. The reports from agents, the patterns they've been trained to detect, the growing intensity of Western military activity. Piece by piece, a narrative forms. This might not be an exercise. This might be preparation. Now pause for a moment and imagine The weight of that belief. To think that your adversary, armed with nuclear weapons, might be preparing to strike first. To believe that every delay in response could mean destruction. This is the psychological landscape in which Operation Ryan operates. Not certainty, but fear sharpened into vigilance. Within the KGB and Soviet military command, discussions grow more urgent. Defensive measures are quietly considered. Forces are placed on higher alert, and yet everything remains hidden, unspoken to the outside world. Because to reveal fear is to show weakness. What makes this moment so powerful is how close it comes to misunderstanding. Because on the Western side, there is no plan to attack. Able Archer is exactly what it appears to be, a simulation. But the Soviet Union does not see it that way. They see it through the filter of Operation Ryan. Through years of collected signals, warnings, and assumptions. And in that filtered reality, the risk feels real. This is where intelligence becomes something fragile. Not just about gathering information, but about interpreting it correctly. And when fear enters that process, interpretation can begin to bend. For a brief period in late 1983, the world stands closer to nuclear tension than most people realize. Not because of a deliberate act of aggression, but because of how one side perceives the other. Because of how a carefully constructed operation designed to prevent surprise may have brought the Soviet Union to the edge of expecting one, and yet no missiles are launched. No orders are given. The moment passes quietly, almost unnoticed by the world at large. But inside the corridors of power, something has changed. Because those who were there, those who saw how close perception came to reality, understood something deeply unsettling, that the greatest danger of the Cold War was not always intention, but misinterpretation. And Operation Ryan, though hidden, though rarely spoken of at the time, would become one of the clearest examples of that truth. For now, we pause here. In the next part, we'll explore what happened after, how this moment reshaped thinking on both sides, and how the quiet lessons of this operation continue to echo even today. Take a breath, and when you're ready, we'll continue. Now, let us continue. The tension surrounding Operation Ryan did not end with the conclusion of the Able Archer exercise. There was no announcement, no public acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred. And yet, within the Soviet leadership, something had shifted. For years, the Cold War had been defined by rivalry, a steady, calculated competition between two superpowers. But after 1983, a quieter realization began to take hold inside Moscow, that the system designed to protect them might also be amplifying their fears. Operation Ryan had been built on logic, on the idea that early warning signs could prevent catastrophe. But in practice, it had revealed something far more complicated. That when you search constantly for danger, you begin to see it everywhere. Reports continued to arrive. Even after Able Archer ended, KGB stations around the world maintained their vigilance. Agents still observed, still recorded, still analyzed. But now, there was an undercurrent of doubt. Had they come close to misjudging the situation? Had they nearly interpreted a simulation as a real attack? These were not questions easily asked within the Soviet system. To question intelligence assessments was to question authority. To question authority was to risk consequences. And so much of this reflection remained internal, quiet, unspoken. At the same time, across the divide, the United States and its allies were largely unaware of just how seriously their actions had been interpreted. To them, Able Archer had been routine. Effective, perhaps, but not extraordinary. It would take years, decades in fact, before the full extent of Soviet concern became known in the West. When documents were eventually declassified, historians and analysts would look back on this moment with a sense of unease, because it revealed how close the world had come. Not to war by intention, but to war by misunderstanding. And this is where the story deepens, because Operation Ryan was not simply an intelligence effort, it was a mirror, a reflection of how fear, when left unchecked, can reshape perception. Inside the Soviet Union, leadership began to reconsider certain assumptions. If the West had truly intended to attack, would they have done so during such a visible exercise? If the signals were ambiguous, how reliable were the methods used to interpret them? These questions did not dismantle Operation Ryan overnight, but they introduced hesitation. And in the world of nuclear strategy, hesitation can be as important as action. Meanwhile, the broader Cold War environment began to evolve. New leadership would soon emerge. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power in the Soviet Union. Unlike many of his predecessors, he approached the conflict with a different mindset. He had seen the strain the Cold War placed on his country, economically, politically, and psychologically. And perhaps most importantly, he understood the risks of miscalculation. Gorbachev's policies, glasnost and perestroika, are often remembered for their role in reshaping Soviet society. But they also had an impact on how the Soviet Union engaged with the outside world. Dialogue began to replace silence. Negotiation began to replace assumption. Across the ocean in the United States, Ronald Reagan was also undergoing a shift in perspective. Initially known for his strong anti-Soviet stance, Reagan had come to recognize the shared danger both nations faced. The idea that a misunderstanding, like the one nearly triggered during Able Archer, could lead to irreversible consequences, was difficult to ignore. And so slowly, Cautiously, the tone began to change. Meetings were held, treaties were discussed, and for the first time in years, there was a sense, fragile but real, that cooperation might be possible. While Operation Ryan itself faded into the background, its influence lingered, not as a public lesson, but as a quiet memory within the minds of those who had experienced it. A reminder that intelligence is not just about gathering information, but about understanding it correctly. Because in the end, Operation Ryan did not fail in the traditional sense. It collected data. It mobilized resources. It heightened awareness. But it also revealed a critical flaw. That information without context can lead to dangerous conclusions. Imagine standing in a dark room, trying to understand what surrounds you. Every sound feels significant. Every shadow seems to move. Without clarity, your mind begins to fill in the gaps, and sometimes it fills them incorrectly. This is what Operation Ryan became. A system searching for certainty in a world defined by ambiguity. And in doing so, it came dangerously close to mistaking possibility for reality. Today, historians often point to this moment as one of the closest calls of the Cold War, not because weapons were launched, but because they almost were not needed, because belief alone, the belief that an attack was imminent, could have been enough to trigger a response. And yet, something held. Whether it was caution or doubt, or simply the absence of final confirmation, the decision was made not to act. That decision, quiet, unseen, and uncelebrated, may have changed everything. As we reflect on the story tonight, there is something deeply human at its core, beyond politics, beyond ideology. It is a story about perception, about how we interpret the actions of others, about how fear can shape those interpretations, and about how easily misunderstanding can arise when trust is absent. The Cold War eventually came to an end. Walls fell, systems changed, and the world moved forward. But the lessons of Operation Ryan remain. Because even today, in different forms, nations still observe one another. They still analyze signals. They still try to predict intentions. And the risk of misinterpretation has never fully disappeared. So perhaps the true legacy of this operation is not what it did, but what it revealed. That in a world of uncertainty, the greatest danger is not always the enemy you see, the one you imagine. For now, we bring this story gently toward its conclusion. In the final part, we'll step back from history and reflect on what it means for us today in a quieter, more personal way. Take another slow breath And when you're ready, we'll close this chapter together. And now, we come to the end of tonight's story. A story not of explosions or final battles, but of silence, perception, and the fragile line between caution and fear. Operation Ryan has long since faded into history, its documents archived, its urgency dissolved with the passing of time. And yet the feeling it leaves behind is still with us, because at its heart, this was never just about governments or intelligence agencies. It was about how humans respond to uncertainty, how we try to make sense of incomplete information, how we search for patterns, even when they may not be there. As you lie here tonight, in a world that feels far removed from those Cold War shadows, it's worth remembering just how much of history has turned on quiet moments when someone chose to wait, to question, to not act too quickly. Perhaps that is the gentlest lesson we can take with us, that not every signal demands a reaction, that not every fear reflects reality, and that sometimes the most powerful decision is simply to pause. So as the night deepens, let the noise of the day fade away. Let your thoughts settle just a little more softly. And remember, the world, for all its complexity, has endured not only through strength, but through restraint. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me. I wish you a calm mind, steady thoughts, and a truly peaceful night. Sleep well.